All right, hello everybody. Today I've got a review for you of a book that I read a long time ago, many times, but I haven't read it in a very long time, and so I thought it would be worth it to go back and take a look. Today I'm talking about the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe by Douglas Adams. So I read this book probably back in I would say high school kind of age. I liked it. Eventually I found a big collection of all of the books in the series, and I read through all of those. I ended up giving that collection to a friend, but it's been a little, and so I haven't been able to read it for a long time. So a couple of weeks ago, I picked up a copy of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, in ebook format, of course, and gave it another look through. And this time, I actually picked up a slightly different version from what I had originally read. I picked up the illustrated Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which has illustrations by a guy named Chris Riddle, Reddell. And there are, probably between like 10 and 20 illustrations throughout the book. He's got this kind of very distinct, like thin line, very detailed kind of style where there's a lot of line shading, but I wouldn't necessarily say like cross hatching. But he manages to have kind of he has some kind of an influence from like what's the Monty Python guy's name? Stuff is very distorted. Let's just put it that way. That his drawings are, I think, deliberately drawn in a way that kind of distorts things for comic effect, and it works really well for this book. I mean, he has good imagination on the alien forms and their shapes, while still fitting the descriptions from the book, which I think is a nice touch. It was nice to see something every 10 or 15 pages reading through the book. This book is a classic of sci-fi satire, right? That's kind of what Douglas Adams did. The book is full of kind of your prototypical British humor kind of stuff. There's lots of extended, silly descriptions where he'll find a funny way to describe something in a very roundabout way, so that you kind of like get this little like speed bag kind of hit on your funny bone. For instance, early in the story, there's a guy who is knocking down the main character Arthur Dent's, or one of the main characters Arthur Dent's house, and here's how Douglas Adams describes him. Curiously enough, though he didn't know it, he was also a direct male line descendant of Genghis Khan, though intervening generations and racial mixing had so juggled his genes that he had no discernible Mongoloid characteristics, and the only vestiges left in Mr. L. Prosser of his mighty ancestry were a pronounced stoutness about the tum and a predilection for little fur hats. So you can see there's a lot of like little tiny jokes kind of sewn into there, and the book is like this through most of it. There's lots of like convenient or maybe inconvenient names and things. For instance, one of them is the babblefish. The babblefish, said the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy quietly, is small, yellow, and leech-like, and probably the oddest thing in the universe. It feeds on brainwave energy received not from its own carrier, but from those around it. It absorbs all unconscious mental frequencies from this brainwave energy to nourish itself with. It then excretes into the mind of its carrier a telepathic matrix formed by combining the conscious thought frequencies with nerve signals picked up from the speech centers of the brain which has supplied them. The practical upshot of all this is that if you stick a babblefish in your ear, you can instantly understand anything said to you in any form of language. The speech patterns you actually hear decode the brainwave matrix which has been fed into your mind by your babblefish. So, lots of things that, I mean, he's not trying to do hard science, right? He's putting things in that are convenient, that are useful, and that fit the requirements of the time, rather than trying to create like a deep and complex and nuanced lore so much. So there's a lot of silliness in there. In fact, we get a lot of silliness even in like logic, right? So right after the description of babblefish, we get this argument. It is such a bizarrely improbable coincidence that anything so mind-bogglingly useful could have evolved purely by chance that some thinkers have chosen to see it as a final and clinching proof of the non-existence of God. The argument goes something like this. I refuse to prove that I exist, says God, for proof denies faith, and without faith I am nothing. But, says man, the babblefish is a dead giveaway, isn't it? It could not have evolved by chance. It proves you exist, and so therefore, by your own arguments, you don't. QED. "Oh dear," says God, "I hadn't thought of that," and promptly vanishes in a puff of logic. There's a lot of little philosophical bits that are toyed around within this book, which makes it very entertaining to read as well. And of course, you have your plain collection of like just straight up jokes, right? We have, said Arthur, "it's at times like this when I'm trapped in a Vogon airlock with a man from Beetlejuice and about to die of asphyxiation in deep space that I really wish I'd listened to what my mother told me when I was young. Why? What did she tell you? I hadn't thought of that. Or no, why? What did she tell you? I don't know. I didn't listen. But, right? And of course, another fun part of this kind of humor is that we get a lot of deliberate misunderstandings. For instance, when Arthur is trying to defend his house from getting knocked over, he says to Ford Prefect, "Look, don't you understand?" shouted Arthur. He pointed at Prosser. "That man wants to knock my house down." Ford glanced at him, puzzled. "Well, he can do it while you're away, can't he?" he asked. "But I don't want him to." Right? There's also some great little bits where Douglas Adams pokes fun at things and people that actually exist in real life, kind of, sort of. This is a weird book because the book actually came after a radio show in 1978 that Douglas Adams wrote for. So he wrote this radio show, and in the first time that the radio show popped up, he said, well, how do I phrase this? In the book version, and any version other than the first edition from 1979, in the book, the worst poetry, Douglas Adams writes, is written by someone named Paula Nancy Millstone Jennings of Essex, England, or something like that. Well, that name is actually a play on words of a name of a real person, a real friend of Douglas Adams, or at least a former roommate, who was a poet. The story is, I haven't actually heard the recording of the radio show, but the story is that the early radio show, Douglas Adams actually wrote in his friend Paul Neil Milne Johnstone's name and also his address into the radio show, and Paul was like, "That's very funny. That's funny, very funny, Douglas. But could you please not do that? People are going to read this and come bother me." And so, Douglas Adams said, "Okay, fine." So what is this story about? It's sci-fi satire, so of course it starts out with an improbable and kind of ridiculous situation. Arthur Dent wakes up, and he discovers that his house is about to be demolished. We get a very fun description of where the notice was posted that kind of pokes fun at, like, government functionaries and how they hide useful information in very unlikely places. And it just so happens that as Arthur is trying to protect his house from being knocked down, a friend of his named Ford Prefect shows up and is like, "You need to come to the bar with me right now." And Arthur's like, "I mean, no, but yes, but why?" And so off they go. It turns out that the same day that they are tearing down Arthur Dent's house, the Earth itself is also scheduled to be torn down through a very similar series of, kind of unlikely but hilarious events. And so Arthur and Ford escape the Earth minutes before it's destroyed by hitchhiking onto the Demolisher's spaceships. And that's where the story starts. We end up with this kind of grand adventure across space where not planning, but improbability itself takes the wheel. It's a fun story. It's funny. It's not very long. The illustrations by Chris Riddle are quite fun to watch, quite fun to look at. The first part of the story is kind of, it's almost a little dark. But what seems to happen is that about halfway through the story, or a little less than halfway through the story, there pops up a character into whom all of the darkness of the story seems to kind of coalesce. And so the rest of everything around them becomes a little bit lighter hearted, and it really starts to flow at that point. It's a really fun story once you get past that slightly dark kind of beginning. We'll go into a spoiler section in a minute, but kind of just wanted to say that, like, this is a fun book. If you've never read it, it won't take you very long to read it. It's a classic of satirical science fiction. It's not a hard read or difficult, anything like that. And as long as you don't have like a significant personal, repugnance toward British humor, you'll probably enjoy it very much. And of course, this is just the first book in a series of several books, and so it's a good kind of way to dip your toe in and have a taste and determine whether or not you think you like the whole series, which you very much might. So, what I'll say is that it has over the course of the book, it is, all of the things that I mentioned before in the quotes are kind of seeded throughout the book generously. Some laugh out loud bits, a lot more of like ha 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 chuckle kind of stuff going on. But in the end, it's a worthwhile read as long as you don't hate satirical sci-fi, and I mean good satirical sci-fi, not like super sarcastic. I mean, there is some sarcasm in the book, quite a bit in fact, but it's not overwhelming. So anyway, I would say if you haven't read the book, I'm going to go into a spoiler section at this point, so go ahead and maybe click to the next chapter. But let's go into the spoiler section where I'll do a bit of a plot synopsis and talk a little bit more in depth. So here we go. All right, spoiler section, here we come. So the story, as I mentioned in the non-spoiler section, the first thing that happens is that Arthur and Ford jump off into this spaceship as the Earth is demolished behind them. And you'd think that action would be, kind of let's continue with that. But actually, Douglas Adams takes a massive jump across the galaxy to an unveiling of a ship. There's this new ship called the Heart of Gold, and the president of the galaxy, who gets a very fun little description of his of what he does and why he's there, and the kind of the history of the galactic empire. His name is Zaphod Beeblebrox, and he steals this Heart of Gold spaceship because on it is a very unique, very special, very fun device called the improbability engine. Now this engine becomes a major component of the story because it basically is a Deus Ex Machina whenever you have something that you either want to happen or you want to not happen. And, from that sense, from a literary perspective, it's a little bit, it's a little bit of a, it makes things too easy, but at the same time, this isn't meant to be a difficult, twisting lore, story. It's a parody and a satire. So parody is probably another word. It's satirical sci-fi. So it's designed to be funny rather than necessarily like mind blowing or like subtle. So after Zaphod steals the Heart of Gold, we jump back to Arthur and Ford, and it turns out that the Vogons are going to try to kick them off of their ship because they are, they don't want them there. The people who brought them on are like this alien race of cooks that like to bother the Vogons, and so they'll bring on hitchhikers, and the Vogons have to hunt them down and throw them off the ship. And they in fact do. But before they do, they say, well, you know what, if you don't want to get thrown off the ship, what we're going to do is we're going to read you some poetry. And this is where the poetry reference comes in to Paula Nancy Millstone Jennings in the book, or Paul Neil Milne Johnstone in reality. And they read the poetry, and it's very funny because, I don't know, Vogon poetry is said to be like the third worst in the universe, right? But like, as they're reading it, Ford Prefect, who is also an alien from Beetlejuice, is like mugging for the camera, so to speak. Like he's under some kind of horrible electronic torture. Whereas Arthur Dent is just kind of sitting there, and he's like, they're just words. It's not like it's really bothering me that much. They try to weasel word their way out of it by saying, oh yeah, it was actually not so bad. It was actually pretty good. And, they get thrown off anyway. But what happens is that as they get thrown off, the improbability engine has been turned on to such a high degree that it just so happens that they end up in the Heart of Gold ship as well, which, is of course, it's an extremely unlikely coincidence. And this is where something interesting happens with the improbability engine. You can set it to an improbability of any value, right? 256 million to 1, or 2 to the 77th power to 1, or something like that, right? And what happens is that stuff will happen, and if you set it just right, the thing that you want to happen will happen, because that's the only thing that has that exact probability of not happening. But if you choose wrong, or if you overshoot, what will happen is that multiple things will happen, and each of them will have different improbability levels that will add up to the original desired number. And so anyway, like, not only do they get picked up, but a couple of other random things happen around the ship, and there's some levity there as well. But basically, what Zaphod Beeblebrox is trying to do is trying to get to this ancient planet where they used to design worlds. And he doesn't actually know why. We find out later in the story that, like, he himself, like, cut off connections to a bunch of stuff inside his own brain. And like, he even signed it. He's like, yeah, that's me, ZB, who did it. That's who did this to you, Zaphod. And so, like, he doesn't know why he wants to go there, but he just knows that he needs to go there. There's an interesting aspect of this because, well, there's a side issue, right? Which is that throughout the whole description of Zaphod Beeblebrox at the beginning of the story, where he's stealing the Heart of Gold, you just don't really get a description of him, a physical description. And so you're just like, oh, he just looks like a guy, whatever, fine. And then once you actually get everybody together on the Heart of Gold, suddenly it's thrown out that, oh, by the way, he's 2 heads. He has 2 heads and, I think, 3 arms. So, you go from this kind of... It's kind of an interesting mental whiplash where you kind of view this character as something fairly humanoid, because he's acting humanoid, right? And then suddenly you're like, I got to reimagine how he actually looks, kind of thing. It's kind of a fun little bit of like narrative... pulling the rug out from under you, basically. They end up going to this big planet, which is called Magrathea, and what it used to do is it used to do designer planets. And so, like, they would somebody would come with a bunch of money and say, hey, I want a planet that's made entirely out of emeralds, or something like that. And they'd make a planet made out of emeralds and sell it to the guy. Stuff like that. Well, it turns out... And this is where the lore gets kind of silly again. Is that, how do I explain this? Okay, millions of years ago, there were some scientists that created a big computer, and I think it's called Deep Thought. And they say, all right, we want you to make. Are you the best computer ever? And it's like, no, I'm the second best computer ever. And they're like, well, what's the first best? Is it this and this and this? And there's this long, drawn out thing where they're like, oh, was it this? Is like, no, that thing can't even, shine my diodes, kind of stuff. But in the end, the Deep Thought says, okay, fine, I'll tell you. I am second only to the computer that I will design for you later on to solve a problem later. And they're like, fine, whatever. What we want to know is the answer to the question of life, the universe, and everything. And the computer's like, well, I can give you that answer. And they're like, okay, cool, give us the answer. He's like, well, it's going to take some time. And they're like, well, how long is it going to take? He's like, about 10 million years, something like that. Some ridiculously long period of time. And they're like, and they're like, well, is it going to be worth it? And like, Deep Thought already shut them out, and is just like, I'm calculating now, go away. And so, like, millions and millions of years later, Deep Thought wakes up. He's like, I got the answer. And this is one of my favorite developments in all of all of satire, is that, like, oh, you have the answer to the question of life, the universe, and everything? And it's like, yes. And it's 2 new philosophers that are like descendants of the ones from millions and millions of years ago. And they're like, what's the answer? And he's like, 42. And they're like, okay, that doesn't help. What was the question? He's like, oh, I can't tell you the question. It's like, oh, are you kidding me? We waited 10 million years for this. And it's just very well done. It's very funny, and it actually is like a going thread that goes throughout the whole series of books, which doesn't get resolved in the way that you expect it to get resolved either. It's very funny, but basically the idea is that Deep Thought then says, oh, well, let me design the computer to come up with the question for you, and they're like, cool, and the computer turns out to be Earth, and then Earth was destroyed 5 minutes before it would have spit out the answer, and so. This is another fun thing, is that, like, the book loves to take things that are, like, weird and take things that are, like, normal and turn them on their heads. So, for instance, it turns out that the most intelligent beings on Earth are little white mice, because they aren't actually little white mice, but their little white mice bodies are, like, 3-dimensional projections of this multi-hyperdimensional being that is, like, super intelligent and stuff. And so everything that we know about little white mice is them doing experiments on us to help get the question so that they can have the question and the answer at the same time. It turns out also that, like, dolphins are also super intelligent, and that the last thing that they did was like a backflip through a hoop that while singing the Star-Spangled Banner, which translates in dolphin to "So long and thanks for all the fish," which is another title of another later story. I don't know. It's just a lot of fun and a lot of silliness and a lot of like your expectations get. I mean, subverted is such a trite word, but it happens in this book in a way that, despite being subversive of your expectations, is also satisfying because you at least get some answers, right? There's no point where they're like, oh yeah, and at no point are you like, well, this is actually going to give me the actual answer, like an actual deep philosophical answer. It's clearly satire. It's clearly making fun, poking fun, and so you're going to get something that you're not that you're not expecting, at least, and that's the fun part of it. So yeah, you get this classic fake out. You get the answer about the question. Earth was computed the question when it got destroyed, and now the white mice are going to build a new Earth to replace the old one and finish the calculation. That's the plan. And then there's like this action scene at the very end, and they escape from the mice, which were going to, number one, take Arthur Dent's brain, and number two, then there was a bunch of police chasing them because Zaphod stole the heart of gold. And so there's an action scene at the end, and at the very end, there's just a hook for the next book, which is like, let's go have dinner at the restaurant at the end of the universe. And it's like, okay, let's go do that. And then the story ends. Fair enough. What I will say is that, there's one funny, okay, so a lot of stories love to, like, make this, like, tense moment, right? Where, like, there's this something's going to happen, and you don't know whether the characters are going to get out of it. I mean, you kind of do, but you kind of also suspend disbelief and pretend that you don't. And this book does this great bit where it sidesteps that. And so there's this point where they're floating above Magrathea, and missiles get fired at them. And then, instead of like trying to make you feel like tension is going on or whatever, Douglas Adams does this. Quote, "Stress and nervous tension are now serious social problems in all parts of the galaxy, and it is in order that this situation should not be in any way exacerbated by the following facts, or that the following facts will now be revealed in advance. The planet in question is, in fact, the legendary Magrathea. The deadly missile attack shortly to be launched by an ancient automatic defense system will result merely in the breakage of 3 coffee cups and a mouse cage, the bruising of somebody's upper arm, and the untimely creation and sudden demise of a bowl of petunias and an innocent sperm whale. In order that some sense of mystery should still be preserved, no revelation will yet be made concerning whose upper arm sustains the bruise. This fact may safely be made the subject of suspense, since it is of no significance whatsoever. But you also don't actually find out who got the bruise on their arm, I'm pretty sure. I looked at it a couple times and it wasn't clear. So, yeah, lots of funny, like, turnarounds of things that you would expect an author to do. Douglas Adams does the opposite, and he makes it funny. So, with that, we'll end the spoiler section, and we'll get on to conclusions. Alright, conclusions. This has gone on long enough, so I'll make this relatively brief. This book is a classic of science fiction satire, or satirical science fiction, or whatever you want to call it. It makes a lot of hay out of the ideas of unexpectedness, of doing things that you wouldn't expect either to happen, or for an author to do, or for characters to do. It really hinges on things being unexpected. And it does so through a plot device that is basically a fun little deus ex machina. We get a lot of silliness and fun. It's a short book. It doesn't take you very long to read. You chuckle a little bit throughout the whole thing. It's very good. We get a little bit of like half-serious philosophy here and there, which is fun and silly and kind of pokes fun at a lot of like deep thoughts, right? There was a 2005 film which I saw of this story and kind of promptly forgot. I don't remember it being bad, but I was pretty young when I watched it, and I don't remember whether it was good or bad or what, and I haven't seen it since 2005. I saw it in the theater back then. So, like, I don't know. The problem with making a book like this into a movie is that a lot of the delight in this book comes from the little flights of fancy of the author, and the little silly descriptions, and the little, like, oh, I said this, but actually I'm going to do this. And you can't really, I'm not going to say you can't, but it's very difficult and often just skipped when you convert something to film. You know, the creator of the film will often skip these little flights of fancy, these little silly descriptions, because, you know, the way that they would most likely put them into the book is through like a narrator, or speaking over an establishing shot, which usually isn't that funny. So I don't know. It can be very hard to translate books like this into film, and so realistically, if you want the full effect of the book, you really should read the book. It's worth your time. And of course, if you do read this book and you get through it and you liked it, then there's not a ton, but there's a decent amount more for you to read. And of course, with good humor, as it is with good humor, the subtleties rule, and so these books are actually kind of rereadable too. I mean, before I gave away that collection, I read them pretty frequently, and then I just kind of like forgot about them. So it was nice to get back to it, nice to see it again, nice to look at it with fresh-ish, or at least largely forgotten eyes, and kind of remember the fun that I had reading this back in the day. So that's what I've got for today. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, very fun book. You can get cheap paperback versions of it. It's been published and republished and published all over a million times. The illustrated version that I got as an ebook was pretty well done. The illustrations were there in high definition, or large pixel counts. The illustrations are fun. They give you a little bit of a goofy British cartoon look at the universe, which is also kind of fun, and it fit in well with the tone of the book in general. So yeah, I'll put a link in the description so you can go check this book out if you like. And yeah, thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and we will be back next time for goodness knows what, but I'll see you then. Have a good one.